Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. 50 years ago, NASA's leading climate expert predicted a new ice age in as little as 50 or 60 years. 30 years ago, NASA's leading climate expert predicted that lower Manhattan would be underwater in as little as 20 or 30 years. And in 2008, he said, in 5 to 10 years, the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. Democrats in the press said he was right, and they recognized him as a climate prophet. Nobel laureate Al Gore said the polar ice cap might disappear by summer 2014. And as Richard Branson explained, Al Gore is also a type of prophet.
Branson is pledging future profits from his airline to the tune of perhaps $3 billion. $3 billion, that's with a B, to fight global warming.
Is Al Gore a prophet? How'd you spell profit?
Joe Biden is also a prophet. On July 4th of last year, he announced that he had defeated COVID-19 and brought the country together. And then at Christmas, he told a very different story.
For unvaccinated, we are looking at a winter of severe illness and death for unvaccinated. For themselves, their families, and the hospitals they'll soon overwhelm.
Since then, the number of active cases in the United States has more than tripled, and the vast majority of deaths in the United States have occurred since the pretend election of 2020. Our world is being run right now by fake news and false prophets. And when someone tries to set the record straight, they get branded a heretic. 5 years ago, I testified at the Washington State Senate, and this is how the Seattle Press reported on my testimony. They didn't report on any of my actual testimony. All they said was, "Climate change denier testifies for 40 minutes." There was no attempt to refute anything I said. They simply branded me as a heretic. Now let's go back more than 115 years and look at a different type of climate prophet. In April of 1805, there was a terrible earthquake in India which killed more than 10,000 people. And at the same time, there was a large volcanic eruption in Nicaragua. 1905 was a very deadly year for natural disasters, with 27,906 deaths occurring in just 16 days during the year. More than 14,000 died in the earthquake in India, and almost 10,000 died in a typhoon in China. Besides the deadly earthquake and deadly typhoon, there was lots of other extreme weather during 1905. And on October 18, 1905, a massive sunspot was discovered by the Vatican. A well-known French astronomer at the time, Abbé Moreau, believed that solar activity controlled the climate and earthquakes. He was credited by the press for having predicted the earthquakes in 1905. He said, "There is a connection between solar activity and volcanoes and even earthquakes." On October 29, 1905, he said, "As the solar activity will slowly diminish, it is highly probable that earthquakes will occur in March or April next." He forecast that there would be earthquakes in March or April 1906. And on April 18, 1906, San Francisco was destroyed by a huge earthquake and fire. The earthquake came at 5:13 in the morning and didn't leave much left of San Francisco. As you can see, almost the entire city was destroyed. The earthquake didn't actually do most of the damage. It was the fire which came later in very high winds that burned up the city. You can see that most of these structures were intact after the earthquake and before the fire came through. Let's take a ride on a trolley car through San Francisco a few days before the earthquake occurred. Not long before the earthquake, some professional filmmakers took a trolley ride down Market Street in San Francisco. As you can see, San Francisco was a very different city at that time. People were well-dressed, polite, and industrious. There was no traffic control, and it was pretty much up to the individual to take care of their own health and well-being. This was definitely not the nanny state which California suffers from now. It was basically a free-for-all, and people used any opening they could find to get across the street. And the police were perfectly happy with what was going on around them. In 1906, people had a lot of self-respect, and they dressed up very nicely when they went out on the street. Months after the earthquake, there were still 50,000 people living in tent cities around San Francisco. This is what a tent city in San Francisco looked like in 1906. And this is what a tent city in San Francisco looks like now. Progressive government in San Francisco over the last few decades has been a complete catastrophe. But let's go back to talking about the climate of 1906. The first modern voyage through the Northwest Passage was completed by Amundsen in 1906. And in 1905, glaciers were melting so quickly in Alaska that the city of Valdez had to be moved to keep from getting inundated with water. For the past few years, the Northwest Passage has been blocked with ice, but 115 years ago the passage was open and glaciers were melting very quickly in Alaska. NASA apparently believes that ice melts when it's cold and it forms when it's very hot outside. On January 7, 1906, Mildura, Victoria set the state's all-time temperature record of 124 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the second year in a row which Mildura recorded temperatures over 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Broken Hill, New South Wales had quite a stretch of hot weather that winter as well. As of 1995, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology recognized the record high temperature in Mildura in 1906, as well as the record temperature in Western Australia. They also recognized the 1877 record in Burke, New South Wales, and the 1889 record in Queensland. But they've since erased all four of these records and in fact have erased everything prior to 1910. Australia's hot past doesn't support the government's prophecies of the future, so they simply made it disappear. Other documents from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology do acknowledge the fact that January 1906 was an extraordinarily hot month. And they also acknowledge that on January 23, 1906, almost the whole state of Victoria was on fire. The Black Thursday Fridays in Australia on January 23, 1906 were catastrophic. At Forbes, New South Wales, the flames were traveling at a rate of 30 miles per hour. And at the same time, the United States was having a spectacular January heat wave. 25 states were over 70 degrees between January 21st and 23rd, 1906. There was a lot of extreme weather in 1905 and 1906, and some people believed the world was drying up and that we were all going to die of thirst. It's pretty cold in Minnesota right now, but in 1906 they had almost no winter. Now let's fast forward 20 years to 1926. Abby Moreau predicted, based on sunspots, that there was going to be a lot of bad weather coming up, including cyclones. And a few weeks later came the most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history. Miami was destroyed by a hurricane. This is what Miami looked like this afternoon. But 1926 was a very different story. This was Mar-a-Lago, which Donald Trump now owns. Miami Beach was largely wiped off the map by the 1926 hurricane. Bayshore Drive was fathoms deep beneath the ocean. The bad weather was universally being blamed on giant sunspots. Gigantic spots on sun blamed for disorders. Gigantic sunspots 25 times the size of the Earth have been discovered by Dr. Archenhold, director of the Treptow Observatory near Berlin, and are believed responsible for the excessive rains and thunderstorms causing unprecedented floods in various parts of the world. The 1926 Miami hurricane was just the beginning of the disasters. The Red Cross said 1927 was the worst disaster year in their history because of floods and tornadoes. The 1927 flood on the Mississippi was the worst flood in U.S. history. It lasted for more than 6 months and forced hundreds of thousands of people to flee the South permanently. And at the same time the floods were occurring, hundreds of people were dying in tornadoes. The 1927 floods reminded this journalist of the catastrophic floods of March 1884. On May 10, 1927, tornadoes killed 150 people. On April 13, 1927, a tornado wiped out Rock Springs, Texas. Tornadoes and floods were smiting Oklahoma. On September 30, 1927, St. Louis, Missouri was largely wiped out by a giant tornado. The autumn of 1927 brought unprecedented heat during September and October. And right after the late October heat wave came the worst flood in Vermont's history. In 2006, I lived for a while in Winooski, Vermont, and commuted on my bicycle to Burlington. I used to ride past this spot every day. Fortunately, the climate is a lot better now. Dr. Moreau did pretty well with his forecasts in 1905, 1906, and 1926. And he made another one in January 1928. The Thames will freeze over in the winter of 1929, and Western Europe will experience conditions somewhat akin to the Ice Age. He got that one right, too. This was the Thames frozen at its mouth on February 12, 1929. It was so cold in Paris that the state director of pawn shops ordered all elderdowns, blankets, and wooden shawls returned to their owners. And in Budapest, 10,000 people participated in a struggle for free coal issued by the government for fires in homes to relieve the cold. 50 people collapsed and were taken to hospital with frozen hands, ears, and feet. Coal saved the people of Budapest in 1929, but that won't be an option moving forwards because the false prophets of today are making sure there's no coal available for the people who need it. 100 years ago, good science saved people's lives, but now we have false prophets and junk science threatening to take people's lives away moving forwards. Toto's been barking about these false climate prophets for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Curie, and Caesar on the web at realclimatescience.com.